Good morning, precious kids. Be sure to be following along on your term sheet and in your textbook. We are in section 15D, Other Invertebrates. We're going to be studying the phylum Mollusca today. That puts us on page 468. So as I look at my term sheet and at the presentation, I want to just remind you to include everything from your term sheet in your Google Slides project. And if you need extra information, be sure to look in your textbook. Okay, so let's look at the picture in front of you. It's a gorgeous picture of different types of organisms within the phylum Mollusca. At the top left, you see a nautilus, which is a really interesting shelled creature. He's a cephalopod, which we consider a head-footed organism. In the top right, we just have a variety of different shells. Some of them are univalves, others of them are bivalves. In the bottom left is one of my favorite organisms. It's a nudibranch. I showed you an interesting picture of a nudibranch on the first slide of the invertebrates. This is another very colorful organism. It just shows God's wonderful creativity. And then of course on the bottom right you see a squid. He looks like he is attacking something for his supper. Squid may be beautiful, mysterious organisms, but they're extremely aggressive. You wouldn't want to be around one when it was hungry. So let's look at general characteristics of all mollusks. The first general characteristic is that all have a tissue called the mantle. Now the mantle is a specific type of tissue, just like your epidermis is a type of tissue. The mantle, all mollusks have a tissue called the mantle. That mantle gives rise to and secretes a shell in most mollusks. But as you just noticed in the picture before, the nudibranch has no shell. We see the very ugly, mundane, brown-gray slug in the summer. It's a shellless mollusk. Well, the mantle gives rise to a shell in most mollusks, but in some mollusks it does not secrete a shell. So all mollusks have a tissue called the mantle, but not all mollusks have a shell. Now, the visceral mass is no big deal. You don't have to include it on your Google Slides project, but just I wanted to include it just for the word. Visceral mass is the internal organs. Now, we're going to start talking about more internal organs. We talked about some internal organs of the earthworm, and we're going to go in a little bit more detail in these organisms as they become, when I say more complex, I don't mean that in an evolutionary sense. I simply mean that they have more and more tissue types and organs. I just mentioned that most have shells, not all of them. Some mollusks have a foot, and we will look at some pictures of those feet. And then some mollusks, such as the snail, univalves, have a radula. Those are teeth-like structures in which they use to scrape, usually vegetation and other things. So let's look at our first organism is a bivalve, and our representative organism in just a moment will be the clam. But let's just talk about the bivalves in general. The word bivalve, if you cut it down into individual, the prefix and the root word, bi means two, valve is the shell. Bivalves always have two shells that are joined by a joint in the back, and bivalves come in many different sizes and shapes. Oysters, as you know, are famous for their pearl that you can find in some oysters. At the top left of this slide, you're looking at a scallop, and it has a scalloped shape on the margin of its shell, and it's a very beautiful creature. You see those little blue dots? Those little blue dots are like eye spots. They're not eyes. They're pigments in which they use to detect shadows. Now, their ganglion will automatically respond to shadows from above by closing their two valves and keeping their visceral organs safe from predators. Once they've closed their shell, it's pretty hard for a predator to be able to feast on their soft organs. In the bottom right, you have some more bivalves, and notice those weird straw-like appendages coming out of them. Those are called siphons, and bivalves can move a variety of ways, one of which is by using a siphon. They have an in-current tube, in-current siphon, which they bring water into, they circulate it through their shell, and then they push it out an excurrent siphon. And in that way, they can use the movement of water through their system for movement. So let's look at the clam specifically as our representative organism for the bivalves. Number one, they're filter feeders. So they don't chew, they don't have radula, they're not necessarily decomposers. They are going to take in plankton with water. So if you look at the far right of this little organism, you see the in-current siphon, and you see a black arrow showing the water flow, and the excurrent siphon. When water is pulled in, it goes immediately across the gills. Now the gills is the first, I believe it is the first respiratory organ that we've discussed. And of course, gills are used by aquatic organisms to pull oxygen out of the water. Now, just a note, the oxygen they pull out of the water is not the oxygen attached to the two hydrogen, as in H2O. No, oxygen is dissolved into the water, and that is the oxygen that diffuses into their gills. As the water goes past their gills, it goes past some, notice they have a mouth, an esophagus, and stomach, and a digestive gland. The plankton and other sediment go in through their mouth, and they literally filter out plankton from their water. The water goes out their excurrent siphon. Of course, you can see they have an anus there. Notice very quickly that they have on the top right and left, they have what is labeled as a valve closing muscle. Now that muscle has been cut off so we can see it, but it's usually attached to the top valve where it is labeled muscle scars. Now the way a bivalve opens and closes its two shells is by using very strong muscles. They have muscles on either side, and they'll use those muscles to clamp their shell closed so that predators cannot have access to their visceral organs. Notice for the first time you see an open circulatory system. These little creatures have a heart in the top middle. You can see a heart. You see some blood vessels. I'm not sure that they're labeled, but nonetheless they have some blood vessels. Now, when the heart pumps, the blood leaves their blood vessels. There's an opening, and the blood literally cascades over their visceral mass, their organs, distributing everything from oxygen to nutrients and so forth. And so for the first time, we're talking about an open circulatory system. Again, ours is a closed circulatory system. The only time our circulatory system becomes open is if you scrape yourself open or you're in surgery or whatever. But our system, our circulatory system, is a closed circulatory system. Now, one more thing I want to show you before I go on. Look at the bottom left, and you see the word foot. Bivalves have a muscular foot which they use to drill into the sand. When you go to the beach, oftentimes you'll see those little tiny sand clams that drill very quickly into the sand after the water current heads out, because they are very vulnerable to birds and other predators. They use that foot to drill, so they can move by using their muscular foot or create movement using their incurrent and excurrent siphon. Now, look in your book on page 469, and you see all of the information we have just covered, and you see a great picture that has been labeled for you. Be sure to use your textbook as needed. Now, let's go on to the gastropods. The word gastro means, what does it mean? It means mouth, and then pod means footed. Now, gastro doesn't really mean mouth. It really implies the gastrointestinal system. But of course, it starts with the mouth. So the gastropods are called the stomach-footed. In other words, their stomach opens up where you find their feet. Now that's awfully odd, I admit, but the gastropods are univalves. We call them univalves because uni means one. Most of them have one shell. Now, the top two pictures, and well, you've got the bottom left pictures, are shellless gastropods. Again, we look at a number of nudibranchs. They're known as nudibranchs, and they literally do not secrete, their mantle tissue do not secrete a shell. And so even though we call them gastropods, they do not have a shell. Now, most of these organisms leave a slime trail. So in the morning when you head outside, you see all these slime trails. Well, you know that a gastropod has gone through usually in the night. And gastropods have radula in which to eat with. Now, radula are teeth-like structures. I will show you a picture in a moment, but notice they're not going to be filter feeders if they have radula. So here's a representative organism, our simple little snail that we would find out in our gardens in the summer. So notice at the bottom right, we have a foot. Well, actually, the foot is labeled on the bottom left, but the foot goes all the way across the anterior, the ventral, not anterior, but the ventral part of the organism. That entire thing is a foot. Now, he secretes slime as he moves, and that slime is so thick and viscous that he literally can crawl across a razor blade and not cut himself, because he doesn't really crawl on the surface of the razor blade. He crawls across the surface of his secreted slime. Just very interesting. Now, if you follow the foot all the way to the right side, you'll see the mouth. And then you see this little scrapey looking stuff called the radula. Again, I'll show you a better picture of the radula. But if you look in the mouth and follow the gastrointestinal tube, you see a stomach labeled, you see the intestines labeled, and then let me see, mouth, cavity. There's the anus where the food would, extra non-digested material would leave. Now, this little guy is also open circulatory system. You see the heart at the bottom, the vessels at the top, and the blood flows over the visceral organs. Now, I'm looking at my term sheet just to make sure I haven't left anything out. I believe this picture is found in your book and on your term sheet. Now, here's a great picture of the radula. Look at the top right, and you see these teeth-like structures. Those are the little scraping teeth. On the upper left-hand picture, you see inside the mouth area and the esophagus, and you see their little radula, and all they do is scrape, 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 and they leave the most hideous holes in my hostas in the summer. I hate snails because they eat holes in my hosta. Now, notice a rabbit might eat along the perimeter or the outside of a leaf, but the snail holes generally are in the middle of the leaf, and they just simply leave holes by scrape, scrape, scraping. Slugs would scrape using their radula as well. So that is a picture of their radula and their mouth parts. Now, there's a very famous little gastropod I want to introduce you to. It's very cool. It is called the killer cone snail. Now, the killer cone snail is, as the name implies, it is a killer predator. In fact, it can kill humans. It's very, very toxic. The bottom picture, I just have a picture of an auger. I'm not going to go into the details of that with these weird class schedules we have. But I want to show you the killer cone snail. I'm going to show you, I assume it is from Animal Planet or something. I'm going to show you an interactive in a moment. But notice with the killer cone snail, you can see two siphons coming out. And the upper siphon, I'm not sure whether that's the in current or the X current, but notice the bottom siphon, something else is protruding. I believe we call that a proboscis, but that is what it's going to use to paralyze its prey. So here we have it, the cone snail.
Crawling along the ocean floor is a cone snail. It looks harmless, but appearances can be deceiving. Four tubes jut out from its shell. The long one at the top is a siphon, which it uses to inhale water and detect prey. The smaller ones on either side are its eye stalks, and in the middle, a deadly proboscis. Concealed within the tip is a lethal weapon. A harpoon loaded with a neurotoxic mix so complex there is no antivenom to thwart it. It's armed with at least 100 different toxins, more than any other creature. When some cone snails go hunting, they like to burrow into the sand and wait. When a meal happens by, the cone snail fires its harpoon. The poisons quickly paralyze the fish. Once its prey is helpless, the cone snail retracts it through its proboscis until it engulfs the fish, swallowing it whole. The snail is no longer hungry, and its appearance no longer harmless.
Okay, tell me that that wasn't incredibly cool. Now, let's go back to some of the information from that video. It said there were over 100 different toxins in the killer cone snail. Now, each one of those toxins is probably good enough to kill you, but now you add 100 of them together. One of the toxins is actually being made synthetically. I believe it's being made synthetically now by pharmaceuticals. And what it does is it is an incredibly effective painkiller. So we think of morphine and codeine and some of these other painkillers. They're extremely addictive. They are very powerful. They're good at what they do, but they're extremely addictive. Well, the killer cone snail has a neurotoxin which turns off pain, and if we can use it in minute amounts, we can use it for painkillers. They are working on this even now, purifying it in pharmaceuticals and so forth. But for every toxin in a toxic organism, generally we can turn it around and use it as a medication in minute controlled amounts. So anyway, that's the killer snail, a cone snail. I just want to tell you before we go on, look at the top left picture. The cone snail is very beautiful. Many people have been known to pick up a cone snail on the beach and say, "Oh, isn't this beautiful?" They lay it on their hands and now they're dead. So just remember, before you pick up a beautiful gastropod, univalve on the beach, remember that not all univalves are as harmless as our snails. So anyway, that was the killer cone snail. And off we go. Here's just a variety of pictures of our nudibranchs again. And these are shellless sea slugs. And as ugly as our brown terrestrial slugs are, these gastropods, these nudibranchs, are incredibly beautiful. Look at the top right nudibranch. Some nudibranchs have the ability to live symbiotically with algae. So notice that looks a little bit greenish. Well, it is greenish. It assimilates algae into its tissues, and so they live symbiotic while the algae is carrying on photosynthesis, making sugars. The slug or the nudibranch protect it and so forth. So anyway, very, very interesting creatures. Okay, moving along, we finally get to the cephalopods. Now, cephal means, please tell me you know what the word cephal means. It means head region. Now, pod means foot. So the head and the foot are in the same area. Now, this picture, my intro picture, shows a variety of cephalopods. On the top left we have our squid. They're incredibly vicious organisms. They're predators. Of course, you have the octopus in the top right and the bottom left. They can also actually be fairly vicious, although most octopus are fairly shy. If you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone. And then of course we have our nautilus. It's one of our few shelled cephalopods at the bottom. Now, as we look at this picture, I just want to mention a couple things. What you see is tentacles. The tentacles have suckers on them, and those suckers will be used to catch prey, hold prey, and so forth. But those are tentacles. So let's go on and let's look at this picture of squid. On the top right picture, you see the tentacles kind of flayed back, and in the center, you see the mouth region. Now, if you were to look very closely, I have a picture on the top left. Inside that mouth region is an incredibly sharp and powerful beak. Now that squid can do lots of harm to its prey. It can literally rip it to shreds. And so it's got a very sharp beak, who would have known, in which it uses to attack its prey. And of course, that's its mouth region too. The two bottom pictures I'm showing you are just beautiful pictures of squid, two different squid, and notice the coloration. We'll talk about it in a moment, but many cephalopods, cephalopods, have the ability to change color. Some of them are very, very flashy in changing their colors. Some cephalopods have ink glands which will help them to escape from predators. Now, let's talk about their movement a moment. They can swim using their tentacles and their bodies in general, but they also have an in-current and ex-current valve which they can use to pull water in, and then they can very, very forcefully push the water out, allowing them to move almost like jet propulsion. If they want to move very, very quickly, they use their in-current and ex-current valves. Now, should a predator come upon a cephalopod, it can spray ink into the water into the vicinity, and while the predator is entirely confused in this smoke screen, the cephalopod will simply use its in-current and ex-current valve to disappear through the water very, very quickly. Of course, many cephalopods also have colored pigments, which they can become very flashy, like the picture I showed you before of the squid, or they can camouflage themselves to look very, very much like the surface on which they find themselves, the substrate. So anyway, most cephalopods have ink glands and camouflage to help them escape from predators or become unnoticed. Now, I have a very interesting interactive about the octopus, so enjoy.
Untamed and uncut.
It's a life or death struggle 80 feet beneath the surface. A deep sea diver is caught in an 8-tentacled death grip.
You see this octopus coming out of this den, and all of a sudden it attacks this diver. It just kept coming and coming and coming.
He's running out of air and time. The giant Pacific octopus is the largest species of octopus in the world, weighing up to 35 pounds, with an arm span of up to 14 feet. It's a normally shy animal that lives in underwater cracks and crevices, and only comes out for food or mating. A deep-sea diver is caught in a deadly wrestling match with a giant Pacific octopus, and the diver is losing.
He couldn't let go. Like, he couldn't get away from the octopus. He just had a tremendous strength in his arms.
Doug Pemberton has 8 tentacles wrapped around him and hundreds of suction cups pulling at his mask and regulator. Those circular suction cups form 2 rows along each tentacle, and they're made of solid muscle. When the octopus latches onto Doug's mask, the flexible outer edge of the sucker forms a seal, unlike a toy suction cup, which can be slid around. Once the octopus's sucker locks firmly into place, it's almost impossible to move.
Doug started pulling on the arms, and maybe the animal said, "I don't like that," and grabbed on even tighter.
While the octopus sucks the life right out of him, Doug is faced with yet another danger. He is frighteningly close to the octopus's beak. An octopus's beak is part of its mouth, located on its underside. Made of a material much like our fingernails, it's the only hard part of the animal's body. When feeding, an octopus first bites its prey with its beak, and then injects them with venom. Although not usually deadly to humans, it causes paralysis in other sea creatures. Doug knows it's now or never. One by one, he painstakingly peels off each leech-like appendage until finally he's free and the octopus gives up.
There was all kinds of things that could have gone wrong. I think he was tremendously lucky.
Lucky indeed. Doug continues to dive, grateful he's never had another run-in with a great Pacific octopus.
I feel very fortunate to have been a part of that encounter. I also feel very fortunate to have gotten away with my life, because it could have turned nasty. It could have turned ugly.
Untamed and uncut. Only on Animal Planet.
I would rather say that gentleman was not so lucky, as he was providentially blessed by getting away. I want to really quickly, we're at the end of this section for the mollusk. I want to really quickly go back to the startup screen, and I wanted to show you, where is it? I wanted to show you one more thing. Here it is on the cephalopods. The blue ringed octopus. Now, as you know, the blue ringed octopus lives, as you probably figured, In Australia, where many toxic organisms live, it's a very, very small, dainty, beautiful looking little octopus. It's very small, and should you ever see it, you're tempted to touch it or pick it up, but it is incredibly venomous. And again, like most octopus, they're very shy organisms, but should you try to pick a fight, that little guy, even though he's very, very small, he has enough toxin to be deadly. So we have finished our next phylum, Phylum Mollusca. You may begin working on your Google Slides project. One thing I continue to encourage you to think about, follow the instructions on the sheet I typed out for you. Read them again, follow them carefully. Spread your material out across many slides. Slides are free. For each major term, I'd like to see a good picture because remember, I'm a fourth grader and you're educating me. Go through your term sheet, make sure all the terms are covered. I'd rather have more information rather than less. I will have very little patience if you leave terms out from your term sheet. And make sure that you just have a professional, nice job done. Note that on RunWeb, I'll let you know when the Phylum Mollusca is due, and enjoy your spring break.